Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com. Today I'm going to be going over the Rossolimo Variation. It's kind of the anti-Sicilian, so it's a very strong variation in the Sicilian defense. Sicilian pawn e4, pawn c5, knight f3, knight c6, and then bishop to b5. Now, if the bishop comes here to b5, that's the Rossolimo Variation. The knight doesn't have to be here, but really I think the Rossolimo Variation shines if your opponent's knight here is on c6. So if it's knight here, if it's not there, if they see pawn to d6, you can feel free to bring your bishop up here, but I really recommend it more if the knight's here on c6. So this is going to be what we're going to be talking about today, some of the main lines that we're going to be talking about. White's main goal is to give up his bishop for doubled pawns here on the c-file. So it doesn't really matter where your opponent goes, more than likely not going to be moving this knight because that doesn't make a ton of sense. But wherever your opponent moves, you're going to be taking this knight, giving your opponent doubled pawns here on the c-file. Now your opponent could decide to play knight here to d4. I recognize that. You could play knight here to c3. Different video we're going to be talking about, but in this particular video we're going to talk about what happens if your opponent leaves his knight here on c6, which is the most common. The most common move that you actually see after this, after the bishop comes here to b5, is pawn to g6. Getting ready to fianchetto his bishop here to g7, control this long dark diagonal that he already has his pawn here on c5 attacking, and then try to win the game from there. As we talked about before, White's game plan is always going to be take this knight and then see what your opponent does. The first thing that we're going to be looking at is if the pawn takes here on c6. Do recognize he can also take with the other pawn, so we're going to look at that as well. But if this pawn takes right here, it's going to be very simple. White's going to play pawn to d3, solidifying this pawn chain right here. His light square bishop is already outside of the pawn chain. It's already been sacrificed for the greater good, so it's okay to go ahead and play your pawn here because it's not blocking off anything. It also opens up the door for this dark square bishop to get involved into the game, especially if your opponent castles on the king side, which more than likely we know is going to happen since there's an semi-open b file right here. This dark diagonal is going to be very, very key for White to go ahead and get his dark square bishop involved into the game. Now from here, a few ways that Black can continue, but usually if, again, you see this pawn here to g6, he's looking to fianchetto his bishop here to g7. After the bishop comes here, we're going to play king castling on the king side. We actually could play knight here to c3, but it gets tricky just because there's a nice little trap you actually have in a few more moves, and also your opponent could just take here, give you doubled pawns as well. I think it's just a little bit easier to keep your opponent with the doubled pawns and just continue with the game plan. So we're going to play, instead of knight to c3, we're going to castle on the king side, and then see what our opponent does. One thing that our opponent might do is play rook to b8. Again, you will always want to get your rooks involved into the game. Rook to b8 seems pretty logical. It's getting this rook over to the semi-open file, controls a lot of the board. Now Black has a rook and a bishop, both aimed at this pawn on b2. Now typically if you look at this, you would say, okay, I need to go ahead and play something that blocks these moves. You could see pawn here to c3. You could try to stop it with knight here to c3. Because, again, White only has one defender on this pawn, and Black has two attackers. But instead, White's going to kind of play dumb instead of trap, and instead he's going to play knight here to d2. One, this is a great square because it also defends this knight here on f3. White's a little bit more focused right now on the light squares, so he can easily centralize his knight if it wants to. But again, this sets a trap because his opponent technically can't take this pawn without giving up material. Now, if he takes with his bishop, White has two ways to go about doing this. He can take with his bishop, and then after the rook comes down, he can swing in with his knight and actually block this rook. So that's one way. Another way is after the bishop takes, the rook can just swing over here to b1. Now, if the bishop takes here on c1, then the rook can swing up here. Even if the bishop takes here on d2, White's definitely going to be up in material. We're going to swing the rook over here to b1. This is going to be very, very difficult for Black to deal with. So White has all of his heavy hitters. It's going to be very difficult for Black to get his other heavy hitters involved into the game. Can't move his light square bishop for a long time. He's going to be very, very hard pressed. White can really start to attack some of these other pieces over here. This pawn over here on a7 could fall potentially, so definitely going to be very, very bad for Black. Now if we come back here and say, okay, what if Black takes with his rook? same kind of action. We're going to go ahead and take with our bishop right here, and then after the bishop takes, then the rook's going to swing over here to b1, and this is going to be very, very good for white. So while it looks like black can go ahead and come down and take that material, he actually can't in practice. So it's definitely going to be good, again, to bring your knight over here to d2, and then continue with the game. Now, if black recognizes he can't take this, more than likely he now wants to castle. He needs to get some kingside safety, or it's going to be a tough road from him. So he could play knight to f6. Seems like the most logical move. Definitely wants to get his king castled on the king side. And so from here, what do? We're going to push forward with pawn to e5, forcing this material to move right here. We do have a protector with our knight here on f3, protecting this from this bishop. So after the knight moves, then we have another interesting move that we can do, and that is knight to b3. Again, kind of stopping what we talked about before, but it also threatens this pawn here on c5. And there's only a few ways to really defend this. The queen can come here to b6, and the pawn can come here to d6. Now, it's actually important for this pawn to come to d6 because this light square bishop for black can kind of hone down and own this long diagonal. If instead the queen comes to b6, trying to protect this material right here, then white can just win with pawn to g4. There's no way to stop this. This knight's going to fall. That's definitely going to be very, very good for white. So again, it's important to play this pawn to d6 to kind of open up that so that white can no longer play pawn here to g4. But because of that, white can play here, taking on d6, and after it takes right here, then the rook can swing over to e1, putting a lot of pressure on black right here. We could see bishop coming here to e6, knight here to g5. Again, more and more pressure from white. This is definitely going to be a very, very good game from white. Now the next variation we're going to go over is if the pawn takes here on c6. We just looked at what happens when the pawn takes from b7. So after the pawn takes here on d6, it opens it up a little bit more for the queen. Black also has the potential to castle on the queen side, although it would be pretty risky, but he does have a little bit more openness in this particular game. So from here, white's going to continue with the same game plan. He's going to play pawn here to d3. Again, solidify this pawn chain. His light square bishop doesn't have to worry about getting outside that pawn chain. So that's no worries from there. The bishop's now going to come to g7, again attacking this long diagonal. But white's going to actually have an interesting move here that's going to be a little bit different. He's going to play pawn here to h3. It's not super aggressive, but it actually saves a lot of heartache because you really don't want in this particular game to have your opponent bring his bishop here to g4, pinning down your knight. It's very, very, very annoying. So just go ahead and play this pawn to h3. It just allows you more flexibility. You can kind of see what your opponent's going to do. If your opponent now plays knight to f6, you could play knight here to c3. Again, you're not really trying to set up a trap because, again, the rook is not here on b8, so we can't come down here anyway. So knight to c3 is fine. He's not even worried about the attack from the bishop over here on g7. So we could see king castling over here, and then bishop here to e3. And this is important because now the queen can come here to d2. It can kind of protect it if the bishop now wants to come over here to h6, kind of break up the king side. And then white still has the option. He can castle on the queen side, he can castle on the king side. So he's developing naturally. His opponent has doubled pawns, and he still has a lot of flexibility as far as how he wants to continue. The next variation that we're going to look at is pawn to e6. Getting ready to play knight here to e7 to protect this knight over here. White's not really going to waste a lot of time. He's going to play bishop takes here and just see what his opponent does. Again, the first one we're going to look at is with the pawn takes here on c6. White's going to continue with the same game plan of pawn to d3. Now usually when the pawn comes to e6, black's looking to push forward with pawn here to d5 because he has so many attackers. Now he can kind of counterattack the light squares. It's very important this position for white not to take. He does not want to give up central control of the board. If he plays pawn here to d5, his opponent can take, black no longer has doubled pawns, and black completely dominates the center of the board with his pawns. You never have to rush to take your opponent's moves. Instead, you can just continue with your own development. From here, white can play castle on the king side. Black really wants to take, but he really can't because after the pawn takes, the pawn recaptures, all of a sudden if we look at it, white still controls the center of the board with the light squares. He has both his knight and his pawn, but black has double pawns here on the C file, but he no longer has pawns on B or D files, so it's going to be even harder for him to protect both of these pawns. Again, much better setup than when your opponent has 3 pawns in the center of the board and he controls the entire center. So if we come back here, again, we don't have to commit and take. We can just go ahead and castle on the king side. If your opponent now decides to play something knight to f6 if we wanted to, now we can play knight to c3. Again, continuing with our own development, if we see pawn here to d4, that's going to be completely fine. Knight here to a5, starting to put more pressure on these double pawns that we see here on the c file. Now if we come back to the beginning, if your opponent doesn't take with a B pawn, instead he takes with his D pawn, again, very, very common. We're going to play pawn here to D3. You'll kind of get a theme. This is pretty easy for white to play because he's going to be doing the same thing over and over. Knight to f6, pretty common, getting ready to bishop here to e7 or bishop here to d6 so we can castle on the king side. We castle and then again just continue to see what our opponent does. We can knight here to c3 because we're not too worried about any rook. We can bring our bishop here to e3 if we want to, bishop here to f4 depending on how aggressive we want to be, queen here to d2, and then continue with our attack. The last variation that we're going to look at is pawn to d6. I don't see it as much, but still somewhat frequent. Getting ready to prepare with bishop to d7 to kind of stop this pin here on the knight on c6. White's going to continue with the same game plan. He's going to play bishop takes on c6. After the pawn takes right here, white plays pawn to d3, solidifying that pawn chain once again. Now again, it depends on what black wants to do. He could play this pawn to d5. We're not going to take. We don't want to take and then have our opponent again control the center of the board, no longer has double pawns. Again, always look at the center of the board and see if you actually want to take or if you just can continue with your own game plan. Again, from here, white can play knight to c3, not too worried about too much. Can't really play pawn here to d4 because knight over here to a4, what we talked about, is going to be completely fine from white. Now, if instead of pawn to d5, another move we could see is pawn to e5. White's now just going to castle on the king side, not too worried about too much. If we now see the rook over here to b8, we can continue with before. Rook to b8, we know the game plan, knight over here to d2. If we see bishop here to e7, a little bit different because the bishop's not fianchettoed on the king side, we can now play knight to c4. Again, very centralized square for this knight, attacking a lot of critical squares. Can always bring it over to a5 if we wanted to. But again, attacking this pawn here on d6, kind of a disruptor. Can't really attack it with pawn here to d5 because it can swing over here and take on e5. And it also has a protector here with his pawn here on f3. So if we come back instead of e5, another thing that we could see is our opponent deciding to play pawn to g6. Makes a lot of sense. Get rid of the fianchetto on the king side. This is again very similar to what we've seen before. You don't have to memorize anything new. We're going to be castling on the king side. Your opponent plays bishop over here to g6, and then white can continue with knight here to d2 if he wants to. So again, this is the Rossolimo variation in the Sicilian Defense. Hopefully you guys learned something. Sicilian Defense, definitely one of the strongest defenses from black. So anytime you have another weapon in your arsenal to go ahead and fight your opponents and actually give them some discomfort when they're playing the Sicilian Defense, I definitely recommend it. So hopefully you guys enjoyed, hopefully you learned something, and I'll see you on the next video. Thanks for watching.